Hey guys, it's Makeshift, and today I'm going to show you how to design an eye embroidery in Embird just like this. Embird is one of the many embroidery programs available. It's my program of choice. It's a one-time fee. You'll have to buy both the Embird editor or the base program as well as the Embird Studio if you want to design your own objects. The Embird editor will let you adjust sizes and some other small edits, but you can't design your own embroidery without the Embird Studio plugin. Embird has some pros and cons. Overall, I find it pretty good. I haven't felt the need to explore other options just yet. It can be somewhat difficult to learn because there aren't a whole lot of resources available. They do have some tutorials on their website, but I didn't find them super useful. I pretty much just explored the program on my own when I started learning it and just learned the hard way by trial and error. So hopefully you'll learn something from this video rather than having to figure it out for yourself. So the design that I'm going to be doing is this eye design right here. And what you want to do is to either, if you have your pattern, you can uh, import it into your embroidery program into Embird, or if you have a printer scanner, you can scan your pattern into your computer and then copy and paste the image into Embird, which is pretty much always what I do. So you can see here that I've taken apart my test plush, which I've drawn on the design of the face, and including the eye here has been actually taped onto this pattern, and I scanned it in here. So now I have the exact placement of the eye embroidery that I want to do. So in Embird itself, I've selected my hoop by clicking the hoop button, and you can click this blue link here to bring up a list of different hoops. And I'm going to be using my standard 5-inch by 7-inch hoop here. And this button down here can flip your hoop horizontal if you'd like it to be horizontal, but my design is vertical, so I'm going to leave it unchecked. And right here, you can see the exact dimensions of your hoop. Mine is 5.12 by 7.09. So in GIMP, which is the program I use to adjust my patterns, I've drawn a box here and set the size down here exactly equal to the size of my hoop. And now I'm going to copy this selection, go into Embird, and paste it in. It's going to ask if you want to scale your image to fit your current hoop. I'm going to hit yes, but my image is already scaled to fit my hoop exactly. So now I have my design pasted into Embird, and it is the exact size of my hoop, and it is the exact size of the pattern that I want to make. So now we have to convert this eye into an embroidery piece. I specifically do my eyes in embroidery instead of applique, and the rest of these pieces you see here are going to be mostly applique. So this eyebrow here, these stripes, and then this color for the muzzle are all going to be applique. And I'll cover applique in a different video. But this eye here is going to be embroidery. And I usually always do my eyes as embroidery. I find that I can get a little bit more detail with embroidery than using applique. And my plushies aren't that big to where I would feel the need to make them applique instead of embroidery to keep softness. I know a lot of people who make larger plushies choose to do applique instead of embroidery to keep the eye nice and soft. If you've ever done vector artwork before, this is going to be a very similar concept where we want to trace this eye into Embird with the tools we have available. And the basic tool of Embird is the fill stitch. And a fill stitch means that we are going to select an area and it's going to fill that area with dense stitches. And the stitches will be so dense that you will not be able to see the fabric underneath the stitches. So I'm going to do a fill stitch for the white of the eye as well as the pupil. And I'm going to choose to do a column stitch for the iris. And a column stitch is a satin stitch. Embird refers to satin stitches as columns. So I think a column will look really nice for this shape. It's going to give it a little bit more dimension than a fill stitch would, and it's going to pop out really nicely. When you design an embroidery, you want to keep your objects from overlapping as much as you can. So you might be inclined to just go ahead and trace this entire shape with white and then overlay the pupil on top of that and then the iris. But this is going to get really thick really fast with all the thread that you're going to lay on top of your fabric. So when you design an embroidery, you want to section off every color. So I will only have the white be around this area of the eye, but you have to overlap it a little bit because fabric has pull to it. So minky and fleece, stretchy fabrics that sink a little bit, they're going to pull as you embroider the fabric, which means if I perfectly lined up this line, it's not going to meet perfectly when I stitch it out in real life. So the first thing I'm going to do is to design a fill object that is not going to have any cover stitches or the actual stitch marks that are going to fill it up, but it's just going to put essentially a basting stitch behind this whole area to keep the fabric from stretching or pulling. So this object here is the fill object in Embird. So I'm going to click it. And if you click once, it's going to have your starting node. And now you just click again and it will make another node. And with these little circles that are between the nodes, you can move them to adjust your line. So now I'm going to just click around the eye until I close off my object. You don't want to do too many nodes because it'll be more difficult for the embroidery program to get something nice and clean. You want to get your shape in as little nodes as possible, but you don't have to be too concerned about having nodes. Like I don't feel like I need to delete this one and just try to get this to stretch with just a single node at the beginning and end, but don't put one, every few spaces away. It's a little bit overkill and it'll be more difficult for the program. As well as for this outline stitch, I don't want it to go to the very edge because I don't want this basting stitch to poke out from outside of where I want my embroidery to be. So I'm going to finish it by hitting this checkpoint, and it's going to default to having stitches. So if I right click and hit generate stitches and hit this 3D view, you can see that it's filled my area with stitches, which is not what I want. If you right click and go to parameters, and if you uncheck make cover stitches, hit apply, you're going to see now that it's just going to have a basting stitch behind this object. And that's what I want. So I'm going to hit OK. And now I just have a basting stitch around the whole area of my eye. So I'm actually going to, well, first I'm going to change this color to white because I'm going to have it just match my eye color, and hit OK. And I'm going to hide this because it's going to get in the way of seeing what my shape should look like. So generally you want to work from light to dark colors. And so that means I'm going to start with the white of the eye. So you want to try and execute your embroidery with as few layers as possible. And so I'm just going to trace the outline of the iris, but I'm going to poke into the areas around it because minky and fleece have pull to them because they're a stretchy fabric. So if I were to perfectly trace where the white area meets the color around it, it's actually not going to end up landing right next to those objects in real life. You're going to end up having a gap between your colors. So you just want to give it a little bit of extra room around the edges. So it's okay that the thread is going to overlap in these areas, but you don't want it to overlap too much. And if you saw there, if you accidentally select a prior node and try to click, you won't add another node. So just click on your previous node and then click to add another one. And a lot of embroidery design comes with trial and error. So I'm going to place my design where I think it's going to work out, but I'm going to do a test run first before I embroider my final object. And I highly recommend doing that because usually always something doesn't work out the way you intended it to, and it's going to require adjustment. So I've got my white area filled up now. My shine point here is also going to be white, but I'm going to embroider this on top of these two objects because I think it looks better when a shine gets embroidered on top rather than embroidering your iris around it so that it's actually the first layer and you're layering on top. I think it looks better if you embroider on top of everything. And it should be okay if you embroider on top of these, even though it's going to be another layer, it should work out. So now that I'm done, I'm going to hit finish object. I'm going to change the color to white. And then I'm going to look at how it looks with right clicking and generate stitches. Now, if I go to the 3D view, it's going to simulate how it's going to look in real life. And so the first thing I see here is this line. If you notice, all the stitches around it look different than this line here. And this is a connection object that Embird makes. So it's either the start or the end point where it's making this long stitch. And it's kind of subtle, but if you look for it, you'll be able to notice it in real life. And you can work around this by changing the start and the end point. So if you go back to edit by right clicking and hitting edit, you can right click on a node and set it as the start point or the end point. So I'm just going to start moving around these start and the end point and testing to see if that line goes away. I haven't really found a rhyme or reason to how I can predict where that line ends up. Sometimes I can put the endpoint somewhere else and that line ends up in a weird place that doesn't make any sense to me. But if you keep adjusting where those endpoints are, eventually that line will move. So now it's up here and it's going to be out of the way. It's going to end up being covered by um, this outline of her eye here. So I'm okay now with where that long stitch is. The other thing we need to do is adjust the parameters. So minky has pile to it. It has a fur, and that means that if your stitches aren't dense enough, you can have the fur end up sticking through your embroidery design. So the threads won't be tight enough to prevent the fur from sticking through it. So if you right click and go to parameters for minky, I always set my density to the very lowest that I can. So I'm going to move it down to 2.0. It's kind of counterintuitive, but the lower your number is, the more dense your object is. So I've set my density to 2.0. And if I hit apply and watch how the threads change, you can see that the stitches now have multiplied significantly. So the other thing you can do is change the fill design. You have different patterns of what it looks like. So if you want to do something fun and do a crazy design like these bricks, you can see how it changes the stitch pattern. But this is an eye, so I want something plain. Um, it defaults to fill 1. You can also do fill 2, which I've been preferring as of late. So if you see how the stitches fall compared to 1, you can see how this kind of makes vertical columns of stitches, whereas fill 2 is more on an angle. I think it looks a little bit cleaner. So I'm going to hit apply and hit OK. And this has made me realize that there is another stitch line here. So you'll be able to see these as you adjust your parameters more. And now I want to get rid of this little stitch line. So I'm going to mess with the start and end points again. Let's see what happens if we do it here. Okay, so now it's here, which is even worse. Let's see what happens if we put it down. I think. Still the same. Okay, so I think I'm going to go with this because now my stitches, instead of having one up here and one here, it's now just down here at the bottom. And this should be covered up by the outline of the eye. So now I'm going to do the pupil. So even though the pupil is going to be black and the eye is going to be a light color, I'm going to do the pupil first because the iris is going to be a column stitch and I want the column stitch to lay on top of the pupil and the white of the eye. So I'm going to again select my fill object and trace around the shape of this eye. But I'm going to use a trick by creating a circular shape with Embird. So I'm first going to click a little bit outside of the pupil, and then I'm going to go to shape, ellipse, and then clicking where I hit my node, I'm going to draw a general shape of the iris. And you just click and move your mouse and it will draw the ellipse. And now I'm going to right click and hit to element, and that's going to create your nodes. And then I'm going to hit finish object. So you'll see that the shape has options for 4 elements, 8 elements, 16 elements, and that's just the number of nodes. So if you have an object that you want a little bit more precision on, you can select more nodes, but you can also just add them yourself after you make the shape. So now I'm going to move this down, and it's not quite as far out beyond the outline that I want it to be, so I'm just going to stretch it a little bit. So obviously it's sticking out from beyond the eye now. So if I right click it and hit edit, I can adjust these nodes to bring it in. Okay, so I'm going to hit finish object. I'm going to change the color to black. And I'm going to change the parameters. So another way you can do this is by selecting an object that has the parameters you want, right click it, drag to the object that you're working on. And when you let go, you can see set identical parameters. And now it's going to match the parameters of my white of my eye. So you can see again this pesky little line. So we have to adjust the start and end point. All right, that one was easy. So now it's tucked up here and it looks better already. So now we're going to do the iris. I'm going to hide the whites of the eye and the iris or the pupil just so that I can easily see this shape. And now I'm going to create a satin stitch for this iris. And Embird calls a satin stitch a column, and this tool here is the create column object. And for a satin stitch, you have to tell it where to put both sides of the stitch. So if you think about how a satin stitch is, it's wide like this, where it starts on one side and goes to the other, and then does dense stitches back and forth, unlike a normal stitch that's just a straight line. So you have to tell it where to put each edge of the satin stitch. So I'm going to start up here and click on one side and then click to the other. And unlike my fill objects, I'm going to actually just trace the iris shape as is, so I don't need to go out any extra. So I'm going to trace exactly, and it's kind of annoying because you have to make sure that your lines are perfectly even. So it just requires a bit more precision when doing your own column object. So now I'm going to select the other side. Okay. And now for ending a column, you right click a node at the end and hit end of segment. Then you hit the checkbox, and this color should be purple. It doesn't matter exactly what color you set it, just so that you know. So I could have just left it at this dark purple, but I can change it to be more accurate. Hit OK. Right click, generate stitches. And now you can see this column shape that we have. So this is going to be very tight stitches back and forth. Sometimes if you make things too thick, you might not see it fill. You can try adjusting the nodes to see if it works better if you maybe remove some of the nodes or try to make your column stitch a little bit smaller, but this should work out just fine. So now if I put my other eye shapes back in view, you can see it's looking pretty good. And now I need to put the shine of the eye on. So I'm going to hide these again so I can see. Do another fill object. And again, I'm going to use this ellipse tool to draw the shine. Right click to elements. I'm going to reposition it. I'm going to bring up my other objects again, set it to white. And I'm going to set identical parameters and then generate stitches and get rid of this line by changing the start and the end point. Okay. So now we have the shine. If I go ahead and test this embroidery and see that I'm having issues with laying this shine on top of the eye here, then I can do a couple things. One would be to adjust how this column stitch goes. I can make it be a little bit more narrow here to where it wouldn't fill just all behind this shine, as well as this fill point here. I could try to make the design come out a little bit less, so that it's just less overlapping areas. And so now I need to trace the eye with this black design here. And so I'm also going to use a column stitch for that. I have a suspicion that I might need to break this up into 2 points because this area is going to get a little bit thick, but we're going to see how it goes. Sometimes if you do a really long column stitch where it's going to have to change directions, it can end up looking a little strange sometimes. But we're going to try it with one first and see how it looks, and then we'll adjust if we have to. So I'm going to create the column object, and I'm going to start down here where it's going to be thin at first. Select one side and start outlining. And again, I'm just going to perfectly outline where I want the black line to be. And your outlines of your eyes are going to be the major reason why you're going to have to do a test embroidery piece. These outlines basically never come out the way you want them on the first try, in my experience. And that might just be a negative of Embird. I hear a lot of people say that in their own particular embroidery program, that if they design something like this, it'll come out perfect on the first try. And that's certainly not the case with Embird. And so the outline ends right here, even though it's a little hard to see. So I'm going to stop right here. I'm going to try to get that end point nice and thin. Okay, right click, end of segment, hit OK, and it changes to black. Generate stitches, see how it looks. All right, this actually looks okay. It seems like it handled this corner area all right. I was a little worried about how it would handle the direction change. Seems like it'll be okay. It looks a little bit weird, but we'll see how it plays out in real life. So I'm gonna put all my pieces back, including the basting stitch. See how it looks. It's pretty good. I think I'm gonna move this outline up a little bit. You can see that it's actually below the white of the eye. Actually, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to move the white of the eye down. So if you right click edit, and then you can just drag this down. Okay. All right. So a couple cleanups we're going to do. One thing to keep in mind is your jumps. So I have my jumps turned off, but if you go to view jumps, it's going to show where your machine is going to jump from object to object. And the jump means, if I hide these to make it easier to see, it's going to stitch this white part of the eye, and then it needs to jump to where it needs to start stitching the black part of the eye. So it's going to stop here and then move over here to start stitching the black. And this jump is going to be a piece of thread that you're going to have to cut off, or if it's the same, if you're changing colors, you'll be able to cut it off before it starts stitching the black. But if I were to say stitch this in white, then it's going to start stitching this object, and you're going to have a jump here, and you want to cut off your jumps when you have them. I personally don't pay too much attention to jumps, partly because how you saw me adjusting the little stitch lines that would come up by changing the start and the end point. You could strategically set your start and end point so that your jumps are less long, but I find it better to adjust out the ugly stitch marks that can come out by changing the start and end point rather than worrying about jumps that I can just cut away. So another thing in the parameters is that it has this thing called pull compensation, and the pull compensation is meant to adjust for stretchy fabrics like minky and fleece that have some pull, both from how the fabric stretches and from the fact that it has some sink to it. So the fabric is a little thicker than something like a cotton. And so if you increase this pull compensation, it's going to try to compensate for the fact that the sink of the fabric might distort how your objects lie up. I actually don't change this. I control for it myself by setting my objects out farther than just designing the white, for example, to where it would perfectly line up with the edge of the iris. That's why I put the white in further into where the iris is. So I personally just control for that on my own instead of trying to let the computer do it for me. So now I have my eye. Um, it looks pretty good, but I have to test what this looks like in real life. So the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and design the second eye. Um, I could just mirror it, but I'm a little picky about how the shine lines up because in real life, you're not going to have the shine be mirrored unless it's just centered. It's going to appear on the same side of both eyes. I can make my second eye quickly by selecting all the objects, right-clicking and hitting group. So what this does now is it treats this eye as a single object, and I'm going to move it to the side a little bit to give some room, and I'm going to copy and paste. So now I have a second one, and what I'm going to do is transform and flip horizontally. And you can generate stitches to see that it is mirrored now. But like I said, this shine should be on the left side of this eye because of how the lighting would be. So I'm going to ungroup here to break apart these stitches, and I'm going to grab this shine and I'm just going to slide it over. Okay. So now I have my eyes and I'm going to test both of these. And that's because there's going to be subtle differences in how it has flipped the object to where this left eye will come out a little bit different from the right eye. So I'm probably going to have to make different adjustments for each of these eyes to get it perfect. But I'm going to go ahead and save. And I'm actually going to move this a little bit. So it was cutting it a little close on space here. I still want to have both of these eyes test in the same hoop, but I'm going to offset them a little bit so that there's room. So the last thing you can do if you're going to have multiple embroidery objects is that you'll see the order here is that it's going to stitch one eye first and then the second eye. I don't need it to do it in that order. I want to minimize my thread changes just because I'm lazy. So what I'm going to do is actually order it so that it's going to stitch the whites of the eye first, and then it can do the pupils. So to minimize jumps here, since it's going to end with the right eye, I'm going to now make it do the right pupil first, and then it's going to do the left pupil. Now it's going to do the left iris, and I'm going to move up the right iris. I want it to do the right shine next, and then the left shine, the left outline, and then the right outline. So now I'm going to only have to change my thread a handful of times rather than a bunch of times for each eye. I'm going to save this and bring it into my Embird editor by hitting this button here, which is compile and put into Embird editor. I'm going to hit center and hoop because I want to have it centered just so I waste less fabric. And I'm going to select my embroidery file format, which for me is .pes. I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to save it and I'm ready to go. So this eye design can now be loaded into my embroidery machine. I use a USB stick and copy it onto the USB, which goes into my embroidery machine. I've also used a wire in the past to just directly link it. Um, in this editor, you can do some things like flip the design if you want to. You can resize it, but the resizing is actually less precise than bringing it into the editor. So if you want to resize an object, I recommend go ahead and opening the studio where you design your eye and resizing it in there and bringing it back into the editor because it will lose some of the detail and some of the precision if you edit the size in just this base program here. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch this out and we're going to evaluate how it looks and then we're going to adjust from there.
So I went ahead and ran my test stitch, and overall I think it looks pretty good. The overall shape stayed just how I wanted it, but there are a few things that I want to fix. So you can see here how the white of the eye is not aligned with the black outline. And again, that's just because of the pull of the minky. We're going to correct this manually in the embroidery program, as well as, it's kind of hard to see, but there's a little tiny bit of white sticking out at the top here, as well as the outline is not perfectly aligned with the eye at the bottom. I also don't like how this eye has been squared off a little bit here, so I'm going to round that shape out. So for the other eye, you can see that the front outline actually is aligned with the white of the eye, and this is what I'm talking about, how you have to stitch out both sides because the way the fabric pulls and the way that this executes is going to be a little bit different when you flip it. So I don't need to make any corrections here because it is aligned, but you do have this issue down here where the white of the eye is going beyond the outline, but I don't have any extra white sticking out at the top here. So I'm going to go ahead and make these changes in my embroidery program.
I'm going to go ahead and make the changes to the eye, and the first thing we had to do was fix this bottom outline from going through the white part of the eye, and that to me just means that the white was going down a little bit too much, so I'm just going to move it up a little bit. And then the white and the black outline were not aligned right here, so I'm just going to move the white part out. And you'll notice how it's not going to line up down here, but the intent is for it to line up, so hopefully when it stitches out it will be perfectly aligned. And then at the top here, the white was sticking out a little bit right behind the iris. And finally, I wanted to make this iris less squared off on the bottom left corner. Okay, so now I have to adjust the other eye. And like I said, the adjustments were a little bit different because of how it stitches out when it's mirrored. But I also have to adjust the bottom part of the eye. And I have to make this iris less squared off. And if you're making any complex adjustments, you might want to go through the mirroring process again, where if you're making major edits to, say, this eye, if you decide to change the design, you might want to just do it on one and then flip it and then make the minor adjustments that differ between one and the other individually from there. But since these are pretty minor changes overall, I just went ahead and did them on both, like the iris that needed to be not squared off. That was a small enough change to where I felt comfortable just doing it myself instead of mirroring the change to make sure that it's perfectly even. So I feel like I can probably get this right the next try, so I'm not going to do another eye test. I'm going to go ahead and design the rest of the face and stitch that out and hope that it all works out. But if it's still not perfect, I'll probably have to do it one more time, but fingers crossed that it comes out just the way that I want it to.
So here are my finished products. I'm happy with how the eyes came out now. The corrections that I made came through, so the outlines are lined up with the whites of the eye on the bottom now. My eye is more rounded on this corner, and I don't have any white sticking out at the top here. So I'm good to go with this design now, so I can go ahead and use these face pieces as the final pattern piece. And I hope you learned something today, and see you next time.